What is going on, yo? Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going over another class in Crystal of Atlan, the last and final class that is going to be releasing on global, the fighter class. The fighter class will branch into two subclasses on release of the game, the Starbreaker and the Cloudstrider. Now, this is a class that I would actually also be maining when the game releases in global. I personally have the most interest in Cloudstrider between the two, Starbreaker and Cloudstrider. But before we go over the Cloudstrider, let's go over the Starbreaker. The Starbreaker is the more close range between the two of the fighter class and definitely takes on more of the traditional fighter role. She is more of your close range brawler with shielding with some of her skills, also a parry with one of her skills as well. The shield, which she can access while charging some of her skills. Starbreaker's main mechanic is going to revolve around using her skills to build a bar at the bottom of her screen, and then using skills to also spend the bar at the bottom of her screen. What you also want to keep in mind is that these skills are not necessarily labeled in any way, so any skill can spend bar, any skill can build bar. Of course, some skills are multi-hitting, leaving those skills to be more in the builder category, and then the charging skills that require her to have longer cast times are definitely going to be the ones that hit harder, leading those into being more spenders. So her main gimmick is revolving around using her skills that build bar to build her bar as much as possible, and then using the skills that are the ones that you charge to get as much damage from those skills as possible. Anytime she actually spends a section of her bar, she will get a 30% damage bonus, going up to 60% once she hits level 45, and she gains access to being able to innately proc her install. What her install will do is put her into the fire state. In the fire state, she will do enhanced fire damage, as well as gaining supplementary damage similar to Grand Blue Fantasy Relink. If you played Grand Blue Fantasy Relink and you remember the supplementary damage sigils, that's essentially what the fire bonus that she will be getting will do. While inside of her install, she can still generate meter, and what will happen is the section will take a portion of her meter, as well as it will proc the passive at the end of the meter at the left side. That will also flash as well, enabling you to letting you know that you've actually spent both and getting the full 60% damage bonus from her passive. Originally, I thought this class would be very simple comparatively to the Cloudstrider because I did start off playing the Cloudstrider before I played the Starbreaker, but actually after playing in the class and getting in line with how her rhythm and playstyle actually plays, she's a very interactive class that revolves around spending your mechanics or spending your meter wisely. And I say spend her meter wisely because her skills that do a lot of damage have longer charging times, leaving a boss to be able to dash out of the area or potentially hit you, or you just missing while you're actually aiming the skill. That can happen with this class, which will cause a huge DPS loss as you're spending a pretty long cooldown, because her cooldowns aren't necessarily too long on her multi-hitting skills, but for her harder hitting skills, those do have some of the longer cooldowns on her in general. However, her cooldowns aren't too long, so if you do miss a skill, your damage won't necessarily suffer too much. She's more consistent DPS compared to the Cloudstrider, in my opinion, because the Cloudstrider just has longer cooldowns in general. So you want to focus around building your meter with the skills that are multi-hitting, don't do as much damage, and then spending your meter with the skills that hit as hard as possible. It's a very, very interesting and very fun playstyle as well. She definitely did a lot more damage than I originally expected her to do, as well as her leveling experience was one of the smoothest that I had in the game so far. Next, we'll be going over the Cloudstrider. The Cloudstrider is the opposite of the Starbreaker. While the Starbreaker is more of like a striker brawler-esque playstyle, this class is more of a mid-range fighter. Similar to, think of Nen Master from Dungeon Fighter Online. Although she is a mid-range class, she also can thrive close range as well, thanks to the help of her main mechanic. Her main mechanic that you will unlock once switching over to the Cloudstrider will allow her to switch between two stances at will, making her a stance-based class. One stance being the crane stance and one other stance being the tiger stance. This is done via a skill that has no cooldown. Instead of the skill having a cooldown, you'll be able to freely switch between the stances every time you do another skill. Keep in mind that even though the skill switches you between the stances freely, the skill provides no damage. It is merely like a cosmetic skill. In a way, it's merely a cosmetic skill. So you're essentially working with 7 instead of the original 8 skills that you normally get with other classes. To make up for this fact, however, her moveset completely changes depending on which stance she's actually in. So one skill can actually look completely different depending on which stance she's actually in. She also has a third stance. We can call that the neutral stance. This stance is what you actually start the match or this fight actually in. it makes all her skills look green. That's the more greenish stance. So if you ever see any gameplay or any trailers or anything like that showing off like the more green skills, that is just her in her basic stance. So with her playstyle, you're actually able to maneuver between the two stances freely whenever you feel like it, whether you want to be in crane stance or tiger stance depending on the situation. In fact, the best way to play her, in my opinion, is indeed doing that, switching between your two stances freely throughout combat, using the highly damaging tiger stance to get burst damage out, as well as using the crane stance to group, as well as set up for overlapping damage between enemies as well. Going over her two stances, her crane mode is a lot more focused on grouping mobs. Some of her skills in crane mode does not do as much damage as her skills inside the tiger mode. That does not mean that her crane skills don't do any damage. They do pretty good damage. It's just not as much as the tiger mode, as these skills are able to be used at range, as well as have very large hitboxes. Some of her skills in crane stance also removes the animation lock that some of her skills actually have. So for example, she has a skill that she can actually charge as like a ball. It's like a ball that charges over time, and then at the end of the skill animation, it does the most amount of damage after it explodes. While inside your normal form and the tiger form, this ball is actually an animation lock, or this skill is actually an animation lock, and you're not able to necessarily dodge out of it unless you want to lose DPS. However, in the crane stance, it's a move that you're able to just use to group enemies, or if you want to squeeze out extra damage between a boss's stun phase, for example, if you have like a burst online and you don't want to spend too much time in that animation lock there as well. Of course, that doesn't apply to only that skill. There are other skills as well that allow her to actually walk away while the skill is actually actively being cast, so you can do that with those skills as well. Moving on to the tiger stance is definitely where majority of the damage is inside of her kit, as this is where a lot of her large and big multipliers actually are. This stance makes the class a lot more up close and personal. A lot of her skills require her to be up in the opponent's face. For example, she has a skill that splits into 3 different balls, and if you're not directly in front of a boss or an opponent, you could potentially miss balls, missing DPS. Switching stances, as you have already seen, will change most of her skill animations, so the main thing about this class is just knowing which skills you should be using in certain situations and trying to take advantage of her stance switching to get the most damage as possible. Again, you want to be switching between the stances as much as possible, and the game encourages you to do this by giving you an extra 20% damage on the first 2 skills that you actually use when switching to a new stance. This is also on top of the already existing damage buff that she gets for being inside of a stance as well. Alongside being able to switch between stances, she also has some utility in the form of a damage buff for either herself or for the team. How she actually applies this buff is she has a skill that she can actually buff herself. If she's in the tiger stance, it'll go between 10 to 16% damage buff depending on how many enemies are actually hit with the skill, or she can also use the skill inside of the crane stance for a 10% damage taken increase for whatever enemy is actually hit. The crane stance version is single target, so it's very good against bosses, and it'll also set up essentially what happens is she does like a Doctor Strange thing where she pulls like the opponent's soul out of their body, or like an after image of them out of their body, and as long as the after image is outside of the actual boss or whatever enemy you hit, that boss will be taking 10% extra damage. This class does have some of the longer cooldowns that I was able to see inside the game, so some cooldown reduction also does this class some wonders as well. That is it for the fighter overview for Crystal of Atlan. The game will release tomorrow as of me making this video, so definitely let me know which class you guys will be going for in the comment section below. Will it be the Starbreaker or the Cloudstrider? Me personally, I'll be going for the Cloudstrider. Thank y'all for watching, and peace.